most important, that touched the Kashmir, that touched the Abyei. Most commonly refers to the Abrahamic religions, including Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Non-Semitic refers to the Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Animism and Zoroastrian, we call it Persian religion. The contested territory, very important, sir. The contested territory of Abyei region is an essential ingredient of Semitic constituency in which Islam proselytized the tribal groups living in South Sudan with the support of Arab or Islamic armed forces. With the arrival of Christianity evangelists in South Sudan, these missionaries received the support of British armed forces. However, in case of Kashmir, British colonialism preferred Semitic constituency, supported Islamic forces through Pakistan Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan and opposed non-Semitic religion, particularly Sanatan or Hindu Dharma of India. The Islamic fundamentalist slogan of Ghalib, Ghalib, Chalib means either convert, die or live in Kashmir, drove Hindu community out of Kashmir, is the forced exodus of non-Semitic peoples. Whereas in Abyei region, the Western interest made a choice in favor of Christian constituency against the Islamic counterpart. See, this is the juxtaposition of religious fault line and livelihood pattern, and supported agro-pasture group of Nagob Dinka and not nomad tribe group, believed in Islam. Here I quote one important author, Far Masaja, what he said. Far Masaja, considered as an example until the conflict with the Abyssinian Nagus and English, which led him to lose his post. However, his action immortalized in the Italian nation narrative, making him an apostle of Africa, and in the 20th century, already in the context of fascism, he became known as Abuna Masea. For this religious ardent enemy of Islam, the mystical closeness between Copts and Muslims were an obstacle to the Romanization process he wanted to impose on the Copts as a whole, despite their differences and difficulties of the Nagus in the government election on Abyssinian Muslims. Besides, another aspect that approached them was the pilgrimage practice, where the Copts went to Jerusalem and Muslims to Makkah, but in Egypt, listen carefully, but in Egypt, for example, all preparations for this spiritual exercise were understood and shared between the faithful of both religions, Jerusalem and Makkah. Coming to the idea of believers versus non-believers, that's what you have given in the concept note. As far as the Sudanese people is concerned, needs an analytical approach to begin with. A rich and the same time thorny subject, the relations of different peoples of southern Sudan with each other living like nature worshippers, with the northern Islamic populations and with the Europeans and Egyptians who controlled the regions through the Ottoman rule, deserve a much deeper analysis. British social anthropology studied the importance of to the knowledge of their social organizations, established strategies of what strategies? Accommodation, re-elaboration of daily life, and conflicts with several external agents that entered Sudan from 1820s onwards. Particular emphasis placed on how the population of Dinka, Nuer, Chiluk, Niam Niam, Nuba and Bari origin, here let me emphasize on the Bari origin, given the importance of Baris in constructing a discourse of Christian ancestry from the ancient kingdom of Nubia. It established tactics that allowed us to glimpse the understanding of their internal transformations in the face of Ottoman rule and Mahdiya. That is again very important one. These populations important in the process of building Ottoman Egyptian control, developing the Catholic civilization project, and increasing the commercial networks of Islamized population. Coming to the, you have mentioned in the concept note the evangelist. I like to add one more word here. You have to add proselytization and evangelists, both. Now I am dealing with the liberty of your, yes, I am dealing with the both. So the sources produced about the proselytization group during the Ottoman period are of Austrian and British, Egyptian and military missionary origin. In these accounts, mainly those of evangelists, it permeated the idea that these peoples were simultaneously bellicose and unreliable, but without failing to possess an innocence they had been loosened by Christianity and civilizing contact and by the anti-slavery military action. The docility of these peoples, and in the case of Dinkas, the warrior character I already referred, sometimes characterized as innate virtue of human being. The Dinkas were in a situation of inferiority, and sometimes they were examples of a fluid and volatile character which made the different external agents never quite sure that they had conquered these peoples from the point of view of alliances and affection. The missionaries of the Institute for the Missions of Nigeria, that is very important one when you look at the South Sudan. My book also focused on that. About Dinka and other peoples in the newspaper chronicles of Good Sphere and newsletters of geographical societies of Paris, London, Rome and Milan, and circulated during the 19th century. Here the most important is the role of Father Camboni. Father Daniele Camboni, full name. He was then 27-year-old. What he described to his father the fear he felt when he had contact with the Dinka population, structured on testimonials from the Egyptian commanders who campaigned against them. What he remarked, quote, "Ever since the tribe of the Dinkas, we had always seen the Negroes fleeing before us, either answered our greeting or fled. Many people armed with spears, shields, poisonous arrows and clubs, I must conclude that they fear us and are more afraid of us than we are of them, which is why when we present ourselves to the black tribes, we walk unafraid and without showing any fear, so that seeing us so firm, they flee if we do not invite them to stay with us," unquote. Further, having to deal with the traffickers, the very important portion, the slave traders. I'm talking about slave traders. So these traffickers as the proselytization and evangelist missions' greatest enemies. Camboni stresses how the English and Egyptian authorities, despite the British ban on trafficking, acted without restrictions on the raids, causing major problems for the Nuer, Dinkas and Lubas who had to move to more distant regions to escape the traffickers. Slave trade seen as a highly damaging activity for the proselytization and evangelist missions, and it condemned, along with what it called the hypocrisy of the Egyptian and European administration who profited from the activity and made it prosper. The Salvanist, another term, salvationist. This salvationist discourse of proselytization and evangelist missionaries for trafficking purposes rendered the civilization mission on the white man. Saying again, civilization mission on the white man, what we said, we generally said, white man's burden. Unworthy for the religious proselytization. The diplomats believed that the purpose of this enterprise was to introduce European civilization to these tribes and to abolish and destroy slavery there. British stationed various companies of soldiers at the principal point along the White Nile, such as the confluence of the Sobet and the Bahre Ghazal, very important area, among the Dinka and others, because of this violent invasion. The majority of the Sudanese, along with the White Nile, withdrew westward into the inferior to flee the oppression of the conquerors. Mr. Baker's great severity violently snatched Sudanese children from the bosom of their families, steal their daughter, mistreat the inhabitants, and barbarously practice the slave trade, as I am assured by the most reliable sources in Egypt and Mr. Baker's private letter. Recently they are published in German press. The Dinka were very much closer to the Catholic missionaries, and their activities and Father Kambani, I'm quoting him again, always expected from them and the Nuba the necessary basis for the implementation of his project. What is project? Regeneration of Africa through Africa. Regeneration of Africa through Africa. The first missionary contacts with the Dinka date back to late 1840s, when they faced rivalries with the Nuer on the one hand and the reapproachment of many slave traders from different backgrounds, who together the leaders of Dinka population conducted conflicts with other Dinka population in order to obtain slaves on the other hand. Mark Nichol, what is that? Mark Nichol signaled as an end of age of no evil and beginning of spoliation. What is that? So the oral tradition of the Dinka recalls a time of harmony when the world was at peace and mankind flourished with a vast herd of cattle. This idyllic state of contentment and relative isolation irrevocably uttered with the advent of the Turk, a term still used to refer to light-skinned foreigners across Dinka land. Their arrival and the disruption brought described as the time when the earth was spoiled. That's how they connected it. So the spoliation, 2 minutes more. Spoliation refers not only to the process of interaction with the Ottoman Egyptian authorities, but also to the insertion of these authorities into the circuits of raids for the slave trade. However, such raiding actions are not easy because the Dinka had ties to several other groups that embodied elements of their culture or even spoke their language. Overall, since 1840, nomadic peoples such as Bagaras, what ma'am has also mentioned, Bagaras, for example, obtained Egyptians' favors for raid, which led them into a series of conflicts with the Dinkas and other peoples, a fact that made proselytization and evangelist missionaries correlate on the figure of the Jaileba, very important also that, Jaileba, which encompassed many peoples as the merchant of human flesh. However, they also engaged in the trade of ivory and products from Egypt to supply the big traffickers, Jeribas, that Madam has explained about it. The confrontation that existed between the Shuluk and the Dinkas and between the Nuer and the Dinkas, and also the possible articulation between them, led the Catholic missionaries of the late 1950s confused and before repeated questions in the history of proselytization and evangelization in that region. What are the questions? Which people should be welcomed and which should be rejected? How to respond to possible aggressions, and what should be the position in the face of firearms? So finally, I quote one Fencini author, what he explained. He said, it is a real story, and he explained how Islamic convert to Christian, okay, on the basis of this real story. 5 years ago, a healthy young African girl called Mehbooba came to Cairo. She had kidnapped along with many others from the Dinka tribe by the inhuman greed of the Jailebas. Since that time, he who alone possesses the great secret of making good from evil was counting on the work of our African Female Institute in order to destine to eternal bliss poor Mehbooba. Indeed, to human eyes, she had become one of the most miserable creatures on earth after being sold and resold several times to Muslim masters. God ordained that she be brought to a devout Greek Catholic lady of Cairo, from whom she learned for first time to stammer those beloved names of Jesus and Mary, in whom alone we are guaranteed to hope for salvation. It could be said that from that moment, the Holy Spirit had decided to work in his soul, and she very soon seemed to be attracted by a few vague ideas of Christianity, which almost as if by accident her mistress had let fall. This did not enough in the fight she put up against the fanatic temptations of Islam. the first proselytization and evangelizers came to be seen as pathfinders of faith, seeds of hope, which were unfolded by the subsequent work of Comboni. The Nobler's experience gained the meaning of mistaken rehearsal. This is again a very important term of the correct evangelization, whose climax would be reached by Comboni. Nobler's period represents a generous but naive attempt in some aspect to bring Christian civilization into an open environment fraught with too many natural obstacles and the hostility of many concerned. Notwithstanding the numerous deaths, the apparent failure and the missionaries' withdrawal, during this period, some exemplary Christians such as Dinka, Petro Keral, and Barry Sovereign Longwood were formed, and the pupils who educated in Europe returned to Egypt and contributed to Comboni missionary resumption back in Sudan. So similarly, another scholar, Horvath's work and the Grigoloni memories explained, and I quote, "It is clear that not only the missionaries but European merchants and the British presence is a permanent threat had an important role on the deepening of ethnic distinctions between the different populations of Sudan. It highlighted the aspects such as fathism and unruly sexuality of the Dinkas, Nuer, Azanders, and Shilluk as an element of inferiority of these people before the Arab Muslims of northern Sudan and the whites of European and Ottoman origin. Finally, the missionary expansion into Sudan entered Khartoum in late 1840s, found a structured Coptic community of Egyptian origin that entered the region along with the Muhammad Ali's expression in the 1920s. According to Berlin, the Khedive have promised the arrival of the Copts, relying on them to boost trade. It also pointed out that the Nubian patriarchal, since the beginning of Islam's expansion in Sudan, was vague as a factor that would have motivated the entry of the Egyptian Copts in order to reactivate it and operate that patriarchal according to Ottoman and Egyptian conquest projects. The missionaries and privileged agents had established relations with the population density of the Mahdi state through marriage, participation in commerce, mediators and narrators, perceived the population density of the Mahdi state and achieved progressive transformations. The missionary look at the relations between the Mahdi and the population of Sudan by missionary mobilization toward the schismatic and infidels. Leo XIII, more than his predecessor, succeeded in uniting his faithful around the goal of saving non-white souls as a passport of remission from the European white soul itself. Given this, the pontiff recalled by conditioning the salvation of whites and blacks to the involvement in the missionary project, the success of colonization ensured. I conclude with the words, the proselytization and evangelist action that wash the wounds and have apologetic zeal. However, despite the suffering, the enslavement in Americas by white Christians offered them the opportunity to know the real truth. In these ways, then the issue of religious freedom remains pertinent in both North, South and Abyei region. With it, the strategies employed by religious minorities in both countries to persuade, encourage and convict their respective national governments remain imperative subjects of analysis. Today, the Abyei region has the oil-fueled region, but the displacement of families and clans has unprecedented progress because of civil war situations. Their ancestral land has instead become a theater of war fueled with inputs of global players' oil interests. That is, the believers' fiefdom in Abyei and injustices towards non-believers in Kashmir ultimately run on the practices of Semitics by dividing and ruling the territories of Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So